The war was reaching its breaking point. The Coalition had long since wiped out the outer colonies, and the last human forces had retreated to Earth in a desperate final stand. All hope seemed lost as enemy ships filled the skies, and their weaponry prepared to unleash destruction humanity had never faced before. But just as the Coalition commanders were preparing for the final assault, a strange new presence entered the battlefield. A colossal warship appeared out of nowhere, drifting into view like an uninvited guest. No one had seen it coming, and no one could make sense of it. Its appearance alone was enough to shake the confidence of the enemy. It was unlike anything the Coalition had ever encountered. This warship defied every logical expectation and every known rule of combat. Its design was chaotic and jagged. It was as if it had been thrown together with no regard for aesthetics or precision. The surface of the ship was a labyrinth of twisted metal and strange energy patterns that seemed to shift with every passing second. Even the most advanced sensors the Coalition had could not make sense of what they were looking at. It was almost as if the ship was a living thing responding to its environment, adapting to the very atmosphere around it. The Coalition commanders watched from their flagships with a growing sense of unease. The warship's presence was completely unexpected, and yet it exuded an aura of confidence. They couldn't explain. They had prepared for an assault on Earth. They had accounted for every variable. But this ship was not part of the plan. They had no idea who built it or where it came from. The only thing they knew for certain was that it was human-made, but nothing like anything humanity should have been capable of. The human resistance had been small and scattered, their forces stretched thin across Earth, and the few surviving colonies, their technology was nowhere near the advanced systems of the Coalition. How could humanity possess a ship like this? What was its power source? And how was it able to move with such agility and speed? Even the most advanced military minds of the Coalition could not comprehend it. But what was worse for them was the ship's ability to avoid enemy fire with impossible precision. As the ship drifted closer to Earth, the Coalition immediately opened fire. Their ships unleashed a barrage of energy blasts and missile strikes aimed directly at the newcomer. But to their shock, the ship dodged every attack. Its movements were unpredictable. It seemed to weave through the explosions and beams of energy, as if it had no regard for the laws of physics. The Coalition pilots attempted to lock on with their targeting systems, but every time they thought they had a clean shot, the ship veered off course in a way that defied any calculations. Confusion turned to frustration within the Coalition ranks. They had no plan for this, no preparation for a ship that could bend the rules of warfare in ways they had never imagined. Their weapons could not land a single hit, and each failed strike only seemed to strengthen the resolve of the human ship. It was clear now that this was not just a ship, it was something more, something that could change the entire course of the war. No one could understand it. But one thing was certain: the warship was real, and it had come to fight. Inside the warship known as the Defiant, the crew moved with purpose. Though many of them were untested in battle, they shared a common understanding. They were humanity's last hope. Each person aboard had been chosen not for their conventional skills, but for their ability to think unconventionally. Captain Rowan stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the swirling chaos outside the viewports. He had once been a strategist for the human military, but his methods had always been too unorthodox, too unpredictable for the higher-ups to fully embrace. When the war began and humanity's survival became uncertain, he had been called back into service. Now he was leading this Galactic crew of rebels, criminals, and misfits into the heart of the most dangerous war the galaxy had ever known. Rowan's mind was always moving, calculating the odds of every move and countermove. But more than that, he had an innate understanding of how to manipulate chaos, how to make unpredictability work in his favor. He was a man who had always found ways to use the unexpected to his advantage. And now, as the Defiant hurtled toward the heart of the Coalition's forces, it was this ability that made him the perfect captain for such a mission. The crew of the Defiant was a strange mix of personalities and skills. But they had one thing in common: they all believed in humanity's potential to overcome the impossible. There was Lieutenant Morrow, a brilliant tactician, who had once been a soldier in the human forces, but had been dishonorably discharged for refusing to follow orders without question. There was Sierra Valen, an exiled scientist, whose theories had once been ridiculed by the Galactic Council. Her understanding of quantum mechanics had led to the design of the Defiant itself. Though no one truly understood how the ship worked, it was her research that had brought it to life. Then there was Raul Keegan, a former criminal mastermind who had turned his life around after seeing the destruction wrought by the Coalition. He was the ship's engineer and could fix anything, but it was his mind for strategy and improvisation that made him invaluable in battle. Together they made up the heart of the crew, and under Rowan's leadership, they became something greater than just a group of survivors. They became a family. And that bond gave them something the Coalition could never understand: a shared purpose that transcended any differences or past mistakes. As the Defiant flew toward the heart of the Coalition fleet, Rowan stood before the crew in the command center, his voice steady but full of fire. "We're not here to survive," he said. "We're here to win. We're here to show them what happens when humanity is pushed to the edge. We fight with everything we have. We fight with our minds, our hearts, and every ounce of willpower we can muster, because we are human, and we will not be defeated." The crew nodded in silent agreement as the tension in the air grew thicker. They knew the odds were stacked against them, but they also knew that the Defiant was no ordinary ship. It had been designed to tap into something deeper, something primal and chaotic. It moved in ways that made no sense, and its technology was as unpredictable as its crew. But that was exactly what made it dangerous. In the next few moments, the Defiant would engage the Coalition's forces, and the crew was ready to show the galaxy just what humanity could do when it refused to follow the rules. The moment the Defiant emerged into the heart of the Coalition fleet, the tension on board was palpable. Outside the ship, the Coalition armada stretched endlessly across the stars, a massive force built on precision and control, but they hadn't accounted for the Defiant. Its presence was like a spark in the darkness, something unpredictable and erratic. The fleet's commander, Admiral Velos, stared at the readings with growing frustration. This was no ordinary human ship. It shouldn't have been able to survive even the initial wave of fire. But there it was, darting through the chaos like a phantom. They had no plan for a ship that didn't follow the laws of battle. Captain Rowan stood calmly at the helm, his fingers flying over the controls, guiding the Defiant through a course no sane pilot would dare attempt. The ship twisted and lurched through asteroid fields and debris clouds as Coalition ships unleashed wave after wave of laser fire and missile barrages. But none of it hit the Defiant. It moved as if alive, each twist and turn defying logic and expectation. Every calculation the Coalition commanders had made was irrelevant against a ship that acted on pure instinct. Lieutenant Morrow stood at the weapons console, scanning the battlefield. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the enemy fleet cluster into formations for coordinated strikes. But she knew that wasn't how the Defiant fought. She didn't need to follow orders or established protocols. She could feel the rhythm of the battle like a living thing, and she knew exactly how to strike without hesitation. She hit a button and launched a barrage of missiles directly into the heart of an oncoming formation. The missiles struck with precision in ways that baffled the enemy, and then the Defiant was gone, weaving between ships faster than they could react. The Coalition fleet was thrown into disarray. They had never faced anything like this before. The Defiant didn't fight like a traditional ship. It didn't even obey basic tactics. It was everywhere at once, constantly shifting direction, constantly attacking from unexpected angles. They couldn't predict it, they couldn't catch it, and they couldn't land a single blow. Sierra Valen worked furiously at the system's interface, trying to keep up with the Defiant's chaotic maneuvers. Her hands danced over the console as she monitored the ship's strange power fluctuations. The energy pulse they had unleashed earlier had disabled several Coalition ships, but the power source remained a mystery to her. The core of the Defiant was more than just a power generator. It was something far stranger, something that bent the very nature of the universe in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Raul Keegan grinned as he monitored the Defiant's engines. From engineering, the ship's design was a mess, but it worked better than anything he had ever seen. The core seemed to draw on the chaos of space itself. The erratic movements, the random fluctuations in energy were its power source, and the crew had figured out how to harness it, not perfectly but enough to keep ahead of the coalition. The more they fought, the more the ship seemed to adapt to the battlefield. As the Defiant danced through enemy fire, Captain Rowan's voice rang out over the intercom. "All right, people," he said, "we've got their attention now. Let's give them something they'll never forget. We're not here to play by their rules. We're here to make them realize what happens when you underestimate humanity." The Defiant charged forward into the heart of the coalition fleet, its weapons charged and ready, its crew united by a single purpose: to show the galaxy that humanity was not to be counted out, not now, not ever. And as they pressed on, they knew one thing for sure: they weren't just fighting to survive, they were fighting to win. As the battle outside intensified, the coalition fleet was beginning to regroup. They had suffered losses, but their numbers were still overwhelming. And their strategy was precise. They had weapons and technology that humans couldn't even dream of, but none of it seemed to matter. The Defiant continued to move unpredictably, as if it were taunting them. It made no sense how the ship could operate like this, how it could avoid their fire and strike in ways that seemed impossible. The coalition's commanders could feel the pressure mounting, but none of their tactics seemed to work against the humans aboard that chaotic vessel. Inside the Defiant, Captain Rowan paced before his crew, his mind working at a frantic pace. He had always relied on his instincts, but now it was more than just intuition. It was the ship itself responding to them, reacting to the enemy, and adapting in ways that no one could have foreseen. He knew the ship was a one-of-a-kind creation, but he was starting to realize just how much of a game-changer it really was. The ship wasn't just surviving, it was thriving in the chaos. The Defiant didn't follow standard combat strategies. It didn't need to. It fed off unpredictability, and in doing so it bent reality itself. Sierra Valen sat in the engineering bay watching the power readings fluctuate. As the Defiant surged forward, the ship's core pulsed with energy in strange patterns. Each time the crew made an unpredictable move, the core seemed to strengthen, as though the ship itself was feeding off the very unpredictability that made it so powerful. She still couldn't fully understand how it worked, or why the ship's energy didn't behave like anything she had ever seen. But there was one thing she knew for sure: the ship was more than just a war machine. It was a living entity, something that resonated with the crew's instincts and chaos-filled thinking. Lieutenant Morrow stood at the weapons station, scanning the chaos ahead. She saw enemy ships lining up to take their shot at the Defiant. But she wasn't worried. The Defiant wasn't predictable, and that made it impossible for the coalition to counter their movements. She knew exactly how to read the battlefield, not based on what she saw, but on what the enemy expected her to do. She fired a volley of missiles, not at the enemy ships, but at a nearby asteroid cluster. The debris acted as a shield, absorbing fire and deflecting enemy shots as the Defiant slipped between the rocks in a way no one could follow. Meanwhile, Raul Keegan was busy with the ship's engines. The Defiant's propulsion system had been designed to be chaotic yet efficient. It wasn't about smooth calculations or clean trajectories. It was about raw power and sudden bursts of speed. Every time the ship changed direction or made a sudden evasive move, the engines adapted to keep pace with the unexpected force behind them. It was a mechanical marvel, but it was also a ticking time bomb. He knew if the engines ever failed to keep up with the ship's erratic movements, the whole thing would fall apart. But so far, the Defiant had proven to be more than resilient. As the Defiant continued to maneuver through the battlefield, the coalition began to realize something: the ship wasn't just an anomaly. It was a human-made weapon of pure chaos and unpredictability, and that alone made it more dangerous than any fleet of carefully planned ships or calculated strikes. Captain Rowan knew the coalition was starting to get desperate, and that meant they would change tactics. But the Defiant wasn't built to follow their rules, it was built to break them. And that was something the coalition would never be able to understand. With a fierce resolve, Rowan addressed his crew over the intercom. "We have them on the ropes," he said. "Keep the pressure on. Don't give them a chance to breathe. If we break their rhythm, they'll crumble." And that's exactly what they planned to do: break the coalition's sense of control once and for all. The coalition was reeling. Their command ships sent out frantic orders as their fleet scrambled to respond to the Defiant's relentless assault. The once confident commanders now found themselves second-guessing their every move. Their meticulous tactics had been rendered useless by a ship that seemed to rewrite the rules of warfare. They had never faced anything like it. Before, they had expected humanity to fight with logic and precision. But instead, the Defiant had proven that unpredictability was its greatest weapon. The Coalition's finest commanders were caught in a cycle of reaction, unable to anticipate what would happen next. As the Defiant surged forward, Captain Rowan could see the change in the enemy's movements. The Coalition was panicking. Their formations were breaking down, their ships scattered in an attempt to outmaneuver the Defiant. But that only played into the ship's strength. Rowan had always known that fear was a powerful weapon, and he could see it taking hold of the Coalition fleet. They were no longer acting with the confidence they once had. Now they were trying to react, and that was exactly what Rowan needed to win this battle. Lieutenant Morrow watched the chaos unfold, her fingers flying over the weapons console. As she tracked the Coalition's erratic movements, she knew exactly how to exploit their fear. She began targeting smaller enemy ships that had broken away from the main formation. One by one, she fired precision shots that disabled their engines or knocked out their shields. It wasn't about destroying them all at once. It was about creating confusion and spreading the Coalition's forces even thinner. Each strike pushed the enemy further into disarray. Meanwhile, Derciera Valen stood in the ship's control room, her eyes glued to the data streams as she monitored the Defiant's systems. The ship was more than just a weapon. It was a puzzle that she was beginning to understand piece by piece. She had never fully grasped the core's energy mechanics, but she could see it now. The Defiant was powered by a force that wasn't just technological, it was chaotic in nature. It was as if the ship fed off the very unpredictability of the battlefield itself. Every time the Coalition adapted, the Defiant adapted right back, making its systems even more potent. She realized that they weren't just using a ship to fight, they were using chaos itself as a weapon. Raul Keegan worked tirelessly in engineering. The Defiant's engines had been pushed to their limits with each erratic move, but they hadn't failed yet. He monitored the readings with precision, his mind calculating the ship's next move. Even as the energy levels fluctuated wildly, he knew the ship couldn't sustain this pace forever. But for now, it was working. The Defiant's power source was a wild, unstable thing. But in moments like this, it was exactly what they needed. The more unpredictable their movements, the stronger the ship became, and that was how they would win this war. Outside the Defiant, the Coalition was beginning to fall apart. Their coordinated strikes had become disjointed, their ships no longer fighting as a unit, but as individual vessels scrambling to stay alive. Captain Rowan knew it was time to strike the final blow. They had broken the Coalition's rhythm. Now it was time to finish what they had started. He gave the order, and the Defiant turned toward the largest enemy flagship, the Sovereign, its massive hull looming in front of them. It had been the symbol of the Coalition's power and arrogance, but now it was just another target. Rowan grinned to himself. They had underestimated humanity, and that would be their downfall. "We're not just here to survive," he said over the intercom. "We're here to break them down and show them what happens when you push humanity too far. Full speed ahead, people. Let's finish this." As the Defiant charged toward the Sovereign, the massive flagship of the Coalition, the crew could feel the tension in the air. It was the final moment, the culmination of everything they had fought for, and every risk they had taken. Captain Rowan's voice rang out across the ship. "All hands brace for impact. We're not just going to fight them, we're going to make sure they remember who we are." The crew responded with a fierce determination. Each person knew this was their chance to turn the tide of the entire war, to show the galaxy what humanity could do when cornered. Lieutenant Morrow stood at the weapons console, her eyes locked onto the Sovereign as it loomed larger in the viewports. She could see the enemy preparing for a final stand. Their shields were raised and their weapons primed. But it didn't matter. She knew exactly where to hit the flagship. She wasn't going for the engines or the weapons. She wasn't even targeting the shields. She was aiming for something far more critical, something that would cripple them without them even realizing it. She fired a volley of missiles that arced toward the Sovereign's command center. The missiles struck with perfect accuracy, disabling their communication systems and causing a massive power surge throughout the flagship. On the Defiant, Sierra Valen watched as the Sovereign's shields flickered. She knew that the missiles had done their job, but it was the next move that would determine everything. The Defiant surged forward once more as it closed in on the flagship. Valen activated the core's destabilizer. The ship's energy systems began to hum with increasing intensity. The core fed off the chaos of the battlefield, but now it was drawing on that energy to create a feedback loop. It wasn't just about fighting the coalition. It was about using their strength against them, taking their own power and turning it into a weapon. Raul Keegan stood in engineering, watching the readings spike as the destabilizer, activated. The Defiant was pushing its limits, but he was certain it would hold. The ship was alive in its own strange way, and right now it was responding to everything the crew had thrown at it. The more chaos there was in the battlefield, the more the ship adapted. It was feeding on the unpredictability, and it was becoming stronger with each passing moment. He couldn't help but smile as the ship's power surged. He knew the Sovereign wouldn't stand a chance. The Coalition's flagship was beginning to crumble. Its communication systems were offline, and its power grid was failing with each passing second. The Sovereign's once imposing presence was slipping away. The crew of the Defiant knew it was only a matter of time before they broke through entirely, but the battle wasn't over yet. The Coalition would not surrender easily, and Captain Rowan knew they would do everything in their power to fight back. "We've got them right where we want them," Rowan said over the intercom. "Now we push harder. Now we show them the true power of humanity. They underestimated us, and now they're going to see what happens when you push us too far." The crew braced for the final push. As the Defiant launched itself into the heart of the Sovereign, it was no longer just a ship. It was a force of nature, something unstoppable, something the Coalition couldn't even begin to comprehend. With one final surge, the Defiant rammed into the Sovereign's weakened hull. The collision was deafening as the ship's weapon systems flared to life at point-blank range. Everything they had worked for, everything they had fought for, came down to this moment, the final battle where humanity would either rise or fall. The moment the Defiant collided with the Sovereign's hull, the shockwave rattled through the ship as metal screeched and groaned under the immense pressure. But the crew of the Defiant held firm. They had made it this far, and they weren't going to stop now. Captain Rowan gripped the helm with both hands, his eyes scanning the damage reports that were flooding in. But there was no panic. There was only focus. They had reached the core of the Coalition's power, and they were about to tear it apart from the inside out. Lieutenant Morrow's fingers flew across the weapons console, firing everything they had into the heart of the Sovereign's defenses. She targeted the weak points of the flagship's infrastructure, the damaged sections of its armor and shield generators, where the Coalition was struggling to regroup. Each shot was calculated to hit where it would do the most damage, and each time the Defiant's weapons connected the Sovereign systems, staggered further, the once imposing flagship was starting to break apart under the relentless assault. Inside the Sovereign's command center, the Coalition commanders were scrambling to respond. They had never anticipated that humanity would have a ship like the Defiant one that could ignore their tactics and tear through their defenses with such brutal efficiency. Admiral Velos paced furiously as he watched his fleet fall apart. He had underestimated humanity. He had assumed they were nothing more than a nuisance. But now it was clear that the Defiant was more than just a ship. It was a symbol of everything the Coalition had taken for granted. The very spirit of defiance that humanity embodied had come alive in the form of this warship. Sierra Valen watched as the Defiant's energy systems surged in response to the chaos around it. She could feel the ship adapting to every move they made as the core pulsed with power. It seemed to draw even more strength from the Sovereign's weakening systems. The ship was no longer just a tool in their hands. It was an extension of their will. Every shot, every maneuver, fed into the ship's strength. The Defiant wasn't just a war machine. It was the embodiment of humanity's last stand, and it was winning. Raul Keegan grinned as he monitored the Defiant's engine systems. The feedback from the Sovereign's damaged power grid was like fuel for the ship. The core was running hotter than it ever had, but it was holding strong. The ship was beginning to tear through the Coalition flagship's remaining defenses. The once mighty Sovereign was crumbling under the onslaught, and Keegan could feel the pulse of victory in his veins. They had come too far to lose now. The Sovereign's shields were flickering and its weapons systems were failing with every strike. The Defiant delivered the flagship's hull was starting to fracture under the pressure, but Captain Rowan wasn't done yet. He knew the coalition would not simply surrender. They would make one last desperate attempt to retaliate, and that meant they had to strike the final blow before they had a chance to regroup. He gave the order to the crew, one last push. They hit them with everything they had. Make sure this ends now. The Defiant surged forward once again, this time its weapons firing in rapid succession, each shot finding its mark. The Sovereign's command center was the next target, the heart of the flagship where the coalition's leadership was scrambling to maintain control with one final barrage. The Defiant's weapons tore through the last defenses and struck deep into the Sovereign's core. The explosion was deafening as the flagship began to collapse in on itself. As the Sovereign erupted in a massive fireball, the crew of the Defiant watched in silent triumph. The battle was over. The coalition's flagship had been destroyed, and with it their morale shattered. The crew knew that they had just changed the course of the war. They had proven that humanity was not to be underestimated, and they had shown the galaxy that no matter how hopeless the odds might seem, there was always a chance to rise against them. The silence that followed the destruction of the Sovereign was deafening. The crew of the Defiant stood in awe as they watched the wreckage of the once mighty flagship drift away in the aftermath. The massive fireball that had erupted from the heart of the coalition's power was now nothing more than a fading cloud of debris and shattered metal, but the Defiant wasn't done yet. They had taken down the symbol of the coalition's dominance. But the war was far from over. Captain Rowan stood at the helm, his eyes scanning the debris fields and the scattered remains of the enemy fleet. The coalition hadn't been completely destroyed yet. There were still ships out there that hadn't been engaged in the battle. They hadn't felt the sting of the Defiant's wrath, and Rowan knew they were still a threat. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope within him. They had done it. They had proven that humanity could fight back and win against impossible odds. The Defiant had shown the galaxy that unpredictability and resilience could turn the tide of any battle. Lieutenant Morrow turned to Captain Rowan, her expression hard, but there was a glimmer of pride in her eyes. "We've done it," she said. "We've broken them." Rowan nodded grimly. "We've given them something to fear. But the war's not over, not by a long shot," he said. "We've won this battle, but the coalition will rebuild. They'll come after us with everything they have." Tertiaira Valen moved through the ship's control room, her mind still racing with the data from the battle. She had never imagined the Defiant's core could have such an effect on the battlefield. It had done more than just power the ship. It had turned the tide of the war. It had become the very weapon they needed to show the galaxy that humanity wasn't just a nuisance, but a force to be reckoned with. She knew the path ahead was uncertain, but she also knew that the Defiant had changed everything. It had given them a fighting chance where there was none. Raul Keegan leaned against the wall of engineering, his arms crossed as he watched the power readings settle after the final push. The Defiant was battered and scarred from the battle, but it was still standing, its energy core still pulsing with strength. He had always known the ship was special, but now he could see it for what it truly was. It wasn't just a ship. It was a living symbol of humanity's defiance and their refusal to be beaten. He smiled as he ran a hand through his hair. "Well, I guess we've got a lot more work ahead of us, but it's nothing we can't handle." The crew gathered in the command center as Rowan addressed them, his voice steady and firm. "This victory was just the beginning," he said. "They will rebuild, but so will we. We're going to take this fight to them every step of the way. We've shown them that humanity isn't going to roll over and die. We've shown them that we can fight with our minds, our hearts, and every ounce of will we've got. And now we're going to finish what we started." The Defiant's engines roared back to life as the ship moved away from the wreckage of the Sovereign, its crew united by their shared victory and the knowledge that they had changed the course of the war. They weren't done yet, but for the first time in a long time, they saw the light at the end of the tunnel, and with it came the hope that humanity would not only survive but triumph over the impossible.